Christianity is the only religion based on physical evidence. All others believe in belief, which is circular reasoning. So, when Jesus spoke to Nicodemus about being born of the Spirit, about being born again, Jesus expected him to understand, based on the well known predictions in Joel chapter 2, verse 28, Isaiah 44, verse 3, Ezekiel 39, verse 29. Each of those prophets had already proven through their 100% success rates at predicting the future that they spoke for God. So, being born of the Spirit or spiritual rebirth should have been obvious to him. So, what is this rebirth? Separation from God is called spiritual death. Reconnection with God is called spiritual birth or spiritual life. Nicodemus and we should understand that sin kills one's spirit. A clever way to put it is in Revelation chapter 20, verse 6. Blessed and holy is he who has part of the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power. Our first resurrection is from spiritual death to spiritual life. Our second resurrection is on Judgment Day. Later in the chapter, the second death is defined as the lake of fire. So, being born again makes one blessed, like in the Beatitudes, which means above the cares of this life in this broken world. Interestingly, the other Greek word that unfortunately is also translated blessed is in 1 Peter 1 verse 3, where born again also appears. This one means to say good things about. And here it is. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his abundant mercy has begotten us again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you, who are being kept by the power of God through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. How did we manage to become born again? Peter wrote that it was through his mercy. Mercy is one step beyond compassion, including an intense desire to fix what ails someone. Jesus has an unquenchable desire to fix us, which happens through the indwelling Spirit, that same Spirit that Jesus mentioned to Nicodemus, unless one is born of water and of the Spirit. The water part's easy, baptism. The Spirit part is given by God to those with his version of faith. As Romans 8 verse 9 says, now you are not in the flesh, but in the Spirit, if indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. Now, if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he is not his. In this promise that we will be born of the Spirit if we have biblical faith, there is a living hope, a confident expectation. Why are we confident? Because of evidence. In this case, the resurrection of Jesus. So we know that Jesus has promised the indwelling Spirit to those with biblical faith. He has promised to cause the spirits of those who develop biblical faith to be reborn. Further, in 1 Peter 1 verse 23, we learn that this happens through the Word. So, being born again happens through the mercy of Jesus, our faith, and the Word, all mixed together. But how do we know that it happened? A disheartening number of people are taught a cheap knockoff faith instead of the faith that's in the New Testament. biblical faith is not defined in just a verse or two. Biblical faith has 7 characteristics. Before we can have even the beginnings of hope that God has accepted us and given us the Spirit, we must have all 7 characteristics. Here's the short version of those characteristics. The first characteristic of biblical faith is understanding the resurrection of Jesus as evidence. I place it first because Paul said that it was of first importance in 1 Corinthians 15. In 6 places, Paul cites the historical truth of the resurrection as essential to faith. It's not just a story. It really happened. But why do we believe it? Because it's in the Bible? No. That would be circular reasoning. We cannot prove the historical validity of the Bible using the Bible. We need to teach people the physical evidence that the event really occurred, such as the reports written by Roman security forces who followed Jesus during his whole career and filed reports that were deposited in the archives in Rome, which later were examined and reported upon by others who published their findings. A second essential characteristic for biblical faith is recognizing the need for a sacrifice and knowing what a biblical sacrifice is. The law of Moses was put together by God so that certain illustrations would be available to explain what this Messiah was all about. Of course, every pagan god required sacrifices, but those sacrifices were about manipulating your God, either to get your God off your back or to bribe your God to do something for you. That is the common understanding of sacrifice. Biblical sacrifice is very different. It is a celebration of forgiveness with family and friends in the presence of God. That is how it is defined in the law of Moses. Although most of the time the Israelites reverted back to their pagan understandings. But why do I need a sacrifice? Because justice is part of God's character. God cannot sweep our misdeeds and excuses under the carpet, pretending they didn't happen. Justice must be satisfied. Unfortunately, sins do not happen in isolation. Whenever we miss the mark, which is the literal meaning of the word sin, or sidestep the truth with some sort of excuse, which is the literal meaning of trespass, that error spreads out and affects others. We cannot undo it. We cannot make it like it never happened. Further, sin often damages our character as we try to rationalize our behavior that what we did was really okay. Since we do not have the ability to undo all the repercussions of our sin and satisfy justice, God had to do it for us. Therefore, God came to earth. One of the reasons he came was to pay off that debt once for all. He did not pay off one debt at a time over the last 2,000 years. He paid off the justice system so that no one could be condemned for their misdeeds. So the question at judgment shifted from what'd you do wrong to faith or not. The third characteristic essential to having biblical faith is acceptance of the Word of God as true. Again, we cannot prove the Bible using the Bible. If that were appropriate, we could prove any religion to be acceptable. What makes Christianity different than all other religions is that it's founded on physical evidence, not on wishful thinking. In 22 places, the various inspired writers emphasize this point. Without an understanding of the physical evidence, it's not predict specific events well in advance 100% of the time. They were not like those who claim to what those promises are. My personal list of promises in the New Testament numbers 884. I put them in an Excel spreadsheet. Some people have more, some have less, because sometimes you split one paragraph into 5 or 6 or 7 different promises, while someone else calls it just one big promise. However you do your counting, the result will be many hundreds of promises. We are supposed to make our decisions in life based on those promises. If we do not know what they are, we cannot trust them. Fifth characteristic of biblical faith is taking on the divine nature. It's also called the obedience of faith. One of those promises, repeated several times, is that those who develop faith will be transformed by the indwelling Spirit. We are not hapless failures. We are not defective. We are not trapped in the flesh, never to overcome. Rather, as part of the promises of God, we are promised that while still on earth, we will be taking on the divine nature. We will be able to be obedient without even thinking about it. A sixth characteristic of biblical faith is a realistic hope of heaven. People who have been poorly taught fall into several categories. There are those who are confident that they are going to heaven because the preacher told them that they were. They have no idea why. They are hoping in hope, and that's not realistic. Others doubt themselves that they will ever be good enough, so they never gain that confident expectation, so they do not have biblical faith. How are they supposed to have physical proof? Well, the answer is given quite clearly in the scriptures, and we'll get to that in just a minute. And the seventh characteristic of biblical faith is evangelism. In 5 different places, the inspired writers connected evangelism with faith. If we are not telling others about this faith, we do not have biblical faith. The most succinct of those passages is 2 Corinthians 4, verse 13, which is a quote from Psalm 116:10. I believed, therefore I spoke. Many people have been told that they have the indwelling Spirit, but without evidence, they cannot be confident. We cannot tell God that He must accept me. We cannot tell God that we are acceptable because we reached the end of a checklist taught by some preacher. Rather, we need to see the action of the indwelling Spirit in ourselves. Now, some groups have very weird ways of seeing the evidence of the indwelling Spirit. The scriptures give us 3 very plain answers to that question. The first one is in 1 John 3, verses 18 and 19. My little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. By this we shall know, see, by this loving, not just in word and tongue, but in deed and in truth. By this we shall know that we are of the truth and shall assure our hearts before him. When you shock yourself that you have started being consistent, that you are actually doing what you know to be right, when you no longer need those convenient excuses, then you know that the indwelling spirit is in operation and you have your proof. A second passage, 1 John 4, verses 12 and 13. No one has seen God at any time. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love has been made consistent in us. By this love, by this we know that we abide in him and he in us, because he has given us of his Spirit. When you suddenly become so selfless that you are stunned by your own choices, then you know that the indwelling Spirit has poured God's version of love into your heart, as described in Romans 5, verse 5. And a third way, in Romans 8, verse 13. If you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. When you are suddenly able to overcome yourself to a degree that you had never been able to accomplish before, then you know that the indwelling Spirit is at work remodeling your character. As John wrote in 1 John 5, verse 4, for whatever is born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. In each case, the change is obviously superhuman. Why do I say the change is superhuman? Here's an example from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7. But we have this treasure, the gospel, in earthen vessels, that the excellence of the power may be of God and not of us. This verse is in the middle of 2 chapters about evangelism. So, chapter 4, verse 7 is describing the reaction of outsiders to the gospel. The outsiders completely bypass praising you for your outstanding explanation of the gospel and instead go straight to praising God. Why? Because from the point of view of the outsider, what they just heard was obviously well beyond anything you could have come up with. Obviously, you're just a tool of God. The power is with God, so he needs to be praised. Different passages call this character development by the indwelling Spirit a transformation, or a new person, or conform to the image of his Son. All through the Bible, God has expected people to do what people are able to do. We just can't sit around and God provide our food for us. No, we're expected to work. God expects people to do what people are able to do. But God, throughout history, has chosen to do the things that people cannot do. No matter how much we try, no matter how good we are limited. But we have a large set of promises from God about what this indwelling Spirit does, and all the things the Spirit does are beyond human ability. As it says in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 4, by which, by his divine power, have been given to us exceedingly great and precious promises, that through these you may be partakers of the divine nature, having escaped the corruption that is in the world through lust. Note that this set of promises is for our time on earth, not after we leave. This superhuman character development makes us able to take on the character of Jesus and be masters of living in this broken world as he was. When we shock ourselves with our newfound superhuman consistency and selflessness, when addictions and excuses fall away, then we know that the Spirit really dwells in us.